Hello everyone. Here's another practice derivation. This one comes from set 10.3e. It's number 1e on page 587. So I have the derivation set up, and if you would go ahead and get your paper and pencil and copy it down, and go ahead and see if you can work it out or at least come up with some strategies for arriving at the target sentence, which is there down at the bottom of the proof. Go ahead and hit pause and then resume when you're ready. Okay, so this target sentence is an existential generalization. There is an x, not kxx. And if we look at our primary assumptions, we have a universal and an existential to work with. In an awful lot of cases, but not necessarily all of them, a good strategy for working out a derivation like this is simply to go ahead and assume for existential elimination. And that's what we're going to go ahead and do here. We have an existential generalization there on line 2. It's the only one. We'll start a subderivation on line 3, and we'll see how far it goes. And we're going to get our target sentence inside that subderivation. Okay? So let me go ahead and set up our scope lines. Boom, there's our scope line. So let's go ahead and think about what we're going to use as an auxiliary assumption for this thing. Our existential is on line 2, so we have to assume an instance of the existential. We're going to use a name that's new to the proof and keep it restricted to the subderivation. No names occur, so we'll just go with the name A. That's our assumption for existential elimination. So what were we going to get in the last line of the proof? Well, we're going to get the sentence that we're after. Okay, so there's an x tilde k x x. And I do want us to think about goal assessment here. If you haven't gotten this far, hit pause and think of a strategy and then resume. So what we're going to do here is actually figure out how we would put together a sentence like this. There's an x tilde kxx. That's an existential generalization. We might think about using existential introduction to get it. That means we would need a neutral instance of the generalization, k, tilde k, name, name. We can change our minds later, but we're already using the name A. That might be the name we end up with there. If we did, we would have input for existential introduction. Existential introduction works on lots of names. We wouldn't even have to replace both occurrences of the name A and existential introduction, but of course, given our target, that's exactly what we'd want to do, okay? So that's a little bit of goal assessment. It gives us a new target. It's a simpler sentence to get. Once we're there, we get the existential generalization by existential introduction, and then we get to move it to the next outer scope line by existential elimination. So let's think about how we would get something like this. And instead of coming up with a rule here, let's just start applying some of the rules we can apply. We're already doing all we can to work with line 2. We've instantiated it on line 3, and we'll certainly be using it. Line 3 is relatively simple. There's not a lot we can do with it at the moment. So let's look up here at line 1. It's a universal generalization. What we're going to do is instantiate it to the name A. So K-A-A, horseshoe, M-A, ampersand, N-A. Okay, so that's from line 1, universal elimination. And it helps us to see that we have a conditional on line 4 with K-A-A as the antecedent, and what we're after is the negation of that term. So what we might be thinking is that wouldn't it be nice if we could use modus tollens? Modus tollens is a rule, an SD plus rule that lets you write down the denial of the antecedent of a conditional you already have. Okay, but what does modus tollens require? Well, it requires that you have that conditional, the denial of whose antecedent you want to add to your proof. It just tells you have to have something else first. And what does it tell you? It says you have to have the denial of the consequent of the conditional that you have to work with. Okay, so if we can get the negation of MA ampersand NA, which is the denial of the consequent of the conditional in line 4, modus tollens says, well, then you get to write down the negation of the antecedent of that conditional. Okay? So we will play modus tollens to line 4 together with some other line number. Okay? All right. So now our challenge is to get to the denial of this. And there's a number of ways we can do it. We could certainly do it indirectly. If we wanted to use negation introduction, we could do that. It would require a subderivation. We don't have to use an indirect proof here, though. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to do it in kind of a creative way. We're almost there, actually. So on line 5, we're going to take line 3 and we're going to disjoin it with not MA. So not MA, wedge not NA. That's line 3, wedge introduction. Wedge introduction says if you already have a sentence, in this case we already have the negation of NA, then we can disjoin it with any other sentence we want. Obviously, not MA is going to be convenient for us because we can take line 5 and we actually get line 6 by De Morgan's on it. So line 6, which we already said that we kind of would like to have, just comes from line 5 by an application of De Morgan's. Well, then on line 7, that's where we're going to apply modus tollens to 4 and 6. We have our conditional on line 4, denial of the consequent on line 6. That gives us the denial of the antecedent on line 7. Line 7 itself is the input for existential introduction. We've already planned that out. And then once we have that existential, notice it doesn't have the name A in it. A is restricted to the subderivation. So we can move what we have on line 8 out to the next outer scope line. That's an application of existential elimination on line 2, the existential generalization, and the subderivation starting on line 3, running to line 8. Remember that 3 was a neutral instance of the existential generalization. Okay, nifty little proof there, and there will be more proofs on the horizon.